Hey folks, I wanted to share a couple slides and talk through the religious tradition of Buddhism. And we're going to start with just the story of the historical Buddha, whose name is Siddhartha. So let me just see if I can begin this slideshow. Okay, so Siddhartha Gautama is the name of the historical Buddha. Siddhartha was likely born in modern day Nepal, which would have been sort of northern ancient India, probably around 560 to 480 BCE. His birth story is going to contain lots of miraculous elements. Just as we saw in our unit in Hinduism, there's a comfort level with sort of the notion of myth and metaphor. And it's going to certainly speak to his special status and have many different um, elements and symbols that point to his power. The story is basically that his mother, Queen Maya, was actually on pilgrimage when she felt the birth pangs of the child, and she went under a Bodhi tree, which you can see in that image. This is going to be the tree is going to be a bit of a metaphor. We'll see what happens in the Enlightenment under the same type of tree, the Bodhi tree. And she gave birth to Siddhartha. As you can see in the image, there was all sorts of cosmic significance to this. There was the story that a river flew through to wash the child. Siddhartha immediately stood up, took a few steps. Lotus flowers blossomed in each footstep, and Siddhartha announced that this would be his last birth. So, similar to Hinduism, Buddhism assumes the cycle of birth and death and reincarnation. Um, and we'll see how this unfolds through his story. So Siddhartha comes back to the palace, and there's a story that Asita, who is a seer, a visionary of sorts, is able to recognize that this is a child of great significance, and he actually tells the father that he will either be a great king or a world renouncer, a sannyasin. These were figures in ancient India who would go off into the forest. And we'll see that Siddhartha sort of does play this role, but we're seeking moksha and enlightenment. Moksha was a term we saw in the Hinduism unit about the release of birth and death. The father, upon hearing this prophecy, decides that maybe he could be a sannyasin later in life, but he needs to become a king. And so the story goes that he walled up the palace, and that he only wanted Siddhartha to see all the pleasures of life, and to avoid anything that would make him renounce the world. And Siddhartha basically lives his life that way. He becomes older, he becomes married, he marries a woman named Yashodhara, and they actually have a child, Rahula. And Siddhartha is living a good life, but he's intrigued, and there's different versions of sort of what pushes him, but he wants to see the world outside the palace. He knows there's something more. And so there's different versions of the story, but he goes out and he witnesses for the first time old age, and he witnesses someone sick, and he witnesses death. Um, and as we can recognize, these three elements are the universal human condition. And the purpose of the story, I think, is to sort of imagine a way in which we become aware of the reality of life all at once, right? That we all become old, we all will become sick, and we all will die. And so his fourth vision is a suggestion that there's a way out of this. And here's the role of the ascetic, the sannyasin. And Siddhartha decides this is what he needs to do. Much tensions with his father. He also leaves behind his wife and child. Some versions of the story have him come back to reunite with them, but this is a tradition that is monastic. at some level, and so he needs to leave behind all those attachments. He enters into the forest, and he's able to achieve great success in many of these skills. Siddhartha spends quite a time as a sannyasin. He's able to fast and meditate, and again, lots of miraculous stories of what he's able to achieve. But he decides that this is not a solution either. He's lived a life of luxury in the palace, uh, getting everything he wants and attending to all his senses. And now he's lived a life as a sannyasin, denying the body, denying the senses. And neither, Siddhartha decides, is a solution. So Siddhartha decides that he's going to sit, here we are again, under the Bodhi tree, and enters into a deep meditation and decides that he needs to find the solution to suffering. And the story goes that he's meditating for a long period of time, and that, again, we sort of enter into this cosmic realm where, as he's reaching closer and closer to the enlightenment, Mara, who is a deity, a demon of sorts, of illusion, tries to tempt and stop Siddhartha. He sends his daughters of thirst and desire and passion and delight to pull him away. But Siddhartha is able to see the illusionary aspect of these things. And there's even a great cosmic battle where Mara sends his army to shoot flaming arrows of swords at Siddhartha. And through Siddhartha's meditative power, he transforms the arrows into lotus petals. Um, he then recognizes all of reality. He comes to full enlightenment. We'll talk about that as sort of the goal of Buddhism. And he becomes no longer Siddhartha, but the Buddha. And the Buddha is a title, it means awakened one. So similar to Christ or Messiah in Christianity, which means anointed one, the Buddha, the Siddhartha becomes this awakened one. Siddhartha then becomes convinced. He doesn't feel like he can put into words his understanding, but he becomes convinced to go and preach this. And this is called the Dharma. The Dharma, we may remember from our Hinduism unit, can be translated as duty, but in Buddhism, Dharma with a capital D means the teachings of the Buddha, and it's often called the middle way. And the middle way is this idea of Siddhartha's experience that is not absorbed in the world and within our bodies and senses, and it's also not denying the world and denying our senses, but it's this middle path of being engaged, but also not of the world. And so Siddhartha teaches the first part of the Dharma in what is known as the Four Noble Truths. So I'm just going to do these briefly, but you can look at these more deeply in the book. The first noble truth, really the first two, are descriptive. Siddhartha is trying to describe what we experience and why we experience, and that is life is dukkha. And dukkha is a Sanskrit word. Don't get it confused with dharma, with two D words here in Sanskrit. But dukkha can mean off its axle, literally in Sanskrit. It means pain that comes from being out of joint. It's often translated as suffering, which certainly makes sense, but it's the suffering that caused from impermanence and inconsistencies. And so we all experience that. We have things that we like and enjoy, and then over time, those things will go away. Right. So whether it's everything from like a food we enjoy that, then becomes eaten and is gone, or, relationships in our lives that we come to love people, but then they die. So all things come to an end, and that creates suffering. And the root of that suffering is that we have craving and desire. We want things to stay the same. We push against that nature of reality. And so in some ways, Buddhism will be the most psychological of religion. It's sort of describing the roots and causes of our experiences and emotion. When we move into the third and fourth truths, we're moving into the solution and techniques. So the goal is that if we extinguish the root of the suffering, we can end suffering, not only for ourselves, for others. We'll talk about this in some of the later forms of Buddhism. Um, your your compassion is recognizing your connection and the aiding of suffering to others. And then the best way to do that is through the Noble Eightfold Path. So, right understanding, right speech, right thought, action, livelihood, effort, mindfulness, and concentration. And we'll look at that a little bit more here. So, as with all religious traditions, we often have an original teaching or a founder, and then things start to branch out. So, we just want to recognize in this chart that there are three major schools you'll see at the bottom. Theravada, which means the way of the elders. Theravada in Buddhism is largely found in Southeast Asia. Um, it maintains sort of the ancient scriptures. We'll look at that a little bit more, but it's more of a traditional form. Mahayana, which would be more in East Asia, including parts of China and Korea and Japan. Maha means great, and yana means vehicle. So it's the form of Buddhism that is the great vehicle. We'll look at different parts of that. And then probably the smallest of the three is Vajrayana, which can mean thunderbolt. And that's found largely within Tibet. Um, and just to briefly go through those, Theravada follows the scriptures of the Tripitaka, which is the three baskets. These were literally baskets that contain some of the early manuscripts of Buddhism. The ideal is the Arahat, one who is a monk who is distinguished by wisdom. And in these countries, often the monks wear these orange colored robes. And as a layperson, you can obviously practice Buddhism, but you should support the monks in their quest. And there's a transfer of merit that can come through your support of the monastic communities. Mahayana Buddhism is probably one we might be more familiar with in the West. Zen Buddhism from Japan, things like that come under this. These were collections of schools of Buddhism that incorporated new scriptures and new practices. There starts to become introduced the notion of a bodhisattva in Mahayana Buddhism. Bodhisattvas are beings that sort of function like gods. They're not creator gods or one gods, but they're gods who can aid you in your practice. Now, once again, your attachment to your own practice or your own views can be a problem. Remember, that's the second noble truth. Attachment or thirst or desire can be the root of suffering. But there are devotional practices to bodhisattvas who can aid in your practices and speak to the compassion and support of others. And lastly, Vajrayana. I mentioned Mahayana might be the most familiar, but because of the Tibetan exile and the role of the Dalai Lama in the world, many have become more aware of Vajrayana and Tibetan forms. This is a complex form of Buddhism, lots of different rituals and texts. It intermingled with a lot of indigenous traditions within Tibet and the Himalayan region. But Vajra refers to sort of the thunderbolt or diamond. And so, therefore, there are practices and ways of Buddhism that become sudden enlightenment. And probably one of the more famous translated Buddhist texts is the Tibetan Book of the Dead, which is just a manuscript sort of describing what death looks like, what you will see, and how you might navigate a rebirth. Okay, so that gives us a quick overview of the traditions of Buddhism and gives us a sense of some of the different major schools and things like that. I hope that's helpful, and just wanted to record a little bit to give you a background to that tradition. Thanks.